All right, everybody. Welcome back to episode 5 of Lessons from Terrible Students. As I said in the intro, today we're going to be talking about another leadership topic. We're going to be talking about tough conversations. This is a leadership topic that I think a lot of managers do seem to struggle with. So, since myself and Sarah, we are not leaders, so we do not have the expertise to talk about this subject. As we have done in many other episodes, we have brought in an expert to help us dissect this topic. So I'm going to turn it over to him and let him introduce himself. So, Al, if you'll introduce yourself and kind of give us your background and where you come from.
Sure. Thanks, Jeremy and Sarah. And thanks again for inviting me to be a part of your podcast. My name is Al Sullivan. I'm the founder and CEO of a firm called Inspirus Consulting, Incorporated. We're an organization development firm specializing in leveraging and utilizing the applied behavioral sciences to help leaders and organizations get the most from people. I am originally from Montgomery, Alabama. And after undergrad, I went straight into the military as an Army officer, combat veteran, did that for 5 years, and then went into manufacturing management for about 5 years. And then about 25, almost 30 years, corporate HR, organization development. In the last 16 years, since 2008, I've been running Inspirus Consulting. We have a team of about 17 folks, coaches, data analysts, instructional designers, facilitators, recruiters, and that sort of thing. And it's sometimes I have to remind myself that it's work. We really do enjoy doing it.
Isn't that the goal, right?
Exactly.
That's awesome.
All right. So these topics of these tough conversations, right? So the topics can range from like performance issues to like harassment issues in the workplace. So what I wanted to start with right up front are, do you have any kind of common tips for all of these type of conversations? Because I know it's pretty broad, right? It's kind of a broad subject, but do you have any kind of overall tips that you can give our leaders that are listening to say, okay, what advice do you have for them when they're having trouble either initiating these tough conversations or just having these tough conversations in general?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeremy. There are some common tips. I want to first start by sort of defining how are we even defining feedback or tough conversations, and then why people avoid them. And then to your point, I'll go directly to what are some principles, some common tips that leaders or individuals need to keep in mind before, during, and after these tough conversations. And then we can let the conversation go from there. So to start with, I'll just say that, feedback is really about information about past behavior that has impact on the present, right? And it can actually also influence future behavior. So that's like, hey, I need to have a tough conversation about what? About what has happened in the past. I'm still stuck on it, and it's impacting the here and now, and it's impacting how we work together in the future. So that's how we're defining feedback. Now, why do people even avoid it? A couple of reasons, and they're pretty basic human sort of reasons. I don't think you're going to change. I don't want to be vulnerable to kind of damage our relationship. I don't want to make you upset, right? So on and so forth. There's all kinds of reasons why people don't do it. But the purpose and the focus of it, and if we could just change our paradigm and say, why do I want to connect with Sarah and have this tough conversation? Well, I want to understand, wow, I care about Sarah. I know, like, and trust her. How did our conversation get off track? Like I want to understand that, right? Do I care enough about her to understand that? Secondly, when and if we have this conversation again, how do we reconcile this thing and close it and give each other what we need so that we can get back to working? We can get back to innovation. We can get back to trusting each other, right? So that's how we define feedback. That's why people don't do it. And if we could shift the paradigm and say, is this about me pointing my finger at Sarah, or this is about me understanding why this thing got off track and how she and I can close it so we can move on? So that's the backdrop, right? Any questions about that before I get into your specific question, Jeremy, around what are some key tips to kind of
No, but that's a good reframing of it, because that's not typically how you kind of imagine that conversation.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of, like, obviously for me, it's looking from the outside in, because I haven't had to have, I've been on the receiving end of some of these conversations, right? But I haven't had to facilitate any of these conversations. So yeah, that's a good way to reframe it. That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so now let's dive in very specifically into your question, Jeremy, around what are some tips? So, and then I want to go to a very specific 4-step model. Like when you're in the conversation, what are you doing while you're in the conversation? We're not there yet, so that's coming. So tips, and I will say this: these are tips for the feedback giver. This is you pointing at yourself, which is another paradigm shift. Like, wait a minute, aren't I just supposed to give Sarah a piece of my mind? No, 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 no. Let's start with you, right? So that this conversation with whomever, it can go, better. So there's 7 key principles and tips, if you will, that you should keep in mind when you're preparing to have a tough conversation. And again, Al, is this with my wife? Is this with my boss? Is this with my peer? Is this with an employee? All of the above. Even your neighbor, all of the above. Even someone on the different side of the political aisle of you, all of the above. I'm going to go there.
Yep.
Okay.
Those are some of the most difficult conversations, right?
That's right.
Tell me about it. Tell me about it. All right, so here we go. Principle number 1. You've got to start with what are the goals, right? What is your goal of having this conversation? And even check in on, and I'm gonna keep picking on you, Sarah. Like,
I'll go for it.
I might go to Sarah and I go, Sarah, what's important to you about leading a project, right? And fill in the blank. It could be about whatever. And so what are her goals about leading a project, right? So because when I start this feedback, I need to connect it to what's important to her also, right? Like, oh, wow, I got some feedback for you about the last project we were on. It's now a good time, right? Because now I know what's important to her about the project. So start with goals. Secondly, you got to use description and appreciation, meaning you just simply need to replay the video. Don't add anything to it. Don't take anything away from it. What is working well from the past, and what is not, right? So let me describe what's happening, and let me not add anything to it, and let me not take, like yesterday during the meeting when you stand up to say XYZ, right? I need to just replay the video. Thirdly, and this is related to the second one, description and appreciation, is be concrete and specific. Like I said, yesterday during the meeting, because otherwise she's like, what are you talking about, Al? No, yesterday on March 11th during the EMT, executive management team update. So she knows exactly what I'm talking about now, right? Now, I also need to make sure that there's constructive motives, because let's say that Sarah is gunning for promotion, and no matter what I say, she's going to not hear me because the only thing that matters to her is promotion, or, what have you. So sometimes you might want to just hold on to that feedback, because if a person doesn't have constructive motive, don't even waste your time, right? Maybe you need to kind of like figure this thing out another way, right? I'll be honest with you. I remember once I was in a corporate setting and 2 people were involved in an intimate relationship that was kind of hush hush. And it really explained everything, but I was the last person to find this out. And I was getting ready to give them some feedback. And someone said, well, you do know they're in a relationship. And I was like, oh, so I kind of hit the pause button. So that's what I mean when I say, think about constructive motives. Number 5, give the negative feedback as well, right? Don't just sugarcoat it. Don't just walk around on eggshells. Don't just keep the stuff that's really getting under your skin. You got to go there too, right? And then number 6, look in the mirror and own your stuff. Like, what are your insecurities? What are your assumptions? What are your inferences, right? What's your limiting beliefs? Like, have a conversation with yourself and own your stuff, your own baggage, right? And then lastly, make sure timing is good. Because if Sarah's still mad, I'm still upset, we're still fuming, guess what? It's not time to have a feedback conversation. It's
Agreed.
not. So I would just stop there and go, those are the things that you don't need to try to remember. But if you were to say, let me get myself ready for this feedback conversation, those are the top 7 tips on how you get yourself ready to go have a tough conversation. I'll stop there.
Really great insight. And I'm gonna talk in front of you really fast because this speaks to me as a project manager, like the steps, right? Like my job is very making sure that I'm checking boxes and following steps. But the first thing you mentioned about making sure that you're talking about the goals, because really it triggered something for me when you ask those questions. It also makes sure that you guys are aligned, right? You don't, if you may be expecting something from me that I wasn't even aware of. So you're going to give me feedback on something that, comes out of nowhere. It's not as important to me as it is to you. So I really like that that first step about setting goals, um and then the other thing you mentioned is I like to say keeping the receipts. Thinking, when you are,
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many times I've had feedback conversations with people and they haven't been as meaningful because they say things like, "Will you do this? When do I do this?" Right? It's broad. It's like, well, you're not giving me an example or a specific time where I can reflect on it and say, "Oh, you're right, I do that." So
Yeah,
I'm
the
going to
whole
expand on that a little bit. Like I take it even farther than that. Like at that point, I immediately lose all kind of respect for the conversation. Like if I come back to you and say, okay, you're like, for me, it's more like my deliverable may not be up to a certain standard, or maybe I missed, a deadline on a deliverable, something like that. So if for me, it's like, okay, well, I've heard that you're missing deliverables. Okay, you've heard that I'm missing deliverables, or I missed the deliverable. Like, did I miss the date? And if so, which date did I miss?
Mhm.
Because to my knowledge, I haven't missed any dates. Like, so I'm gonna need to know what you're talking about, because if you can't give me those examples, because now I'm sitting here in this official setting with you and HR beside me, and you guys are showing me paperwork, right?
Mhm.
So it's already arrayed against me. So I'm already in this kind of defensive mode, right? So
Mhm.
I'm gonna need you to have your ducks in a row. I'm gonna need you to be able to tell me you missed this deliverable on this date, so that I can either say, okay, like I
Yeah.
did, that's my fault for whatever reason. Because if you can't do that, then like I'm already checked out at that point, because I'm on the defensive already, because it's already like a negative conversation in my mind, right?
Yeah.
So like when you said that, that's immediately what I go to. Like if they have those receipts, it makes me accept it a little more. And it's like, okay, yeah, like that, you're right. I made that mistake. Like you have to own your mistakes, like as a grown person in your
Mhm.
job, right? Like if you make a mistake, you have to own that, be able to grow. But if they can't give you a concrete, like this is what happened, if they're just kind of nebulous as far as, well, sometimes I hear that you do this. Well, great, but that's not helping me.
got no
Well,
credibility.
yeah, you guys both nailed it, right? Um, and go back to what I said. What's the purpose of feedback? Understanding and closure.
Mhm.
If I can't tell you the dates, the time, the issues specifically, we don't have the same understanding, right? Because there's two outcomes to feedback. Do we understand why this got off track? And what do we need to close this thing? And to your point, Jeremy, if you can't tell me the who, what, when, where, and why, then I don't understand. I
Right.
don't understand, right? Or I don't trust you now because you're not telling me the who. You say, and to Sarah's point, if I say, Sarah, you always do this. Jeremy, you always do that. Wait a minute, Al. I'm not a machine. I'm not Chat GTP. I don't always do anything, right?
Yeah.
Everything is nuanced. It depends on the situation. It depends on the background. It depends on the context. So no one always does anything. So don't say that, right? So you've got to be concrete. You got to be specific, and you can't add or take away from the video. I'll be honest with you. I got some feedback the other day, and someone said, "Al, someone said you said this 5 times and they felt this type of way." The good news is we've re-recorded the meeting. Well, I went back to the meeting. I said, oh, I said it twice, not 5 times. And here's the background and context in which I said it. Someone said they wanted to quit being on the project team. And I said, well, let's take that down a notch and let's think about blah, blah, blah. And it went from I'm saying, oh, Al is being condescending. He said, take it down a notch 5 times versus no, someone was about to leave the team. We want to retain the members of the team. Al said that twice and he explained why. Very different, right? So don't add, don't take away, be clear, be concrete, be specific, and just describe what happened in an objective and neutral way, and realizing that, to your point, Jeremy, the person may say, oh, well, let me explain that, right? Not that I gotcha, right? It's like, well, here's what I experienced. Here's what I observed. Did you observe or experience something different? So let's talk about that. So yeah, let's be concrete and specific.
Yeah. And you use a word there, I think, is really, really important. You use that trust word, right? Like, cause that's what these conversations are all about. Like, everybody has to come to these conversations with trust that there is a good way to come out of this conversation on the other side, that there is positive intent on both sides for some type of closure coming out, right? So when there's not concrete messaging during the meeting, and you can't give me those receipts, that's where, and this is just me talking as Jeremy, right? That's where I lose trust on my end, because now I'm thinking, okay, well, you didn't do your research. You can't tell me exactly what's going on. So clearly you have some type of ulterior motive here of bringing me in here. So now I've lost trust in this conversation.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, okay, well, why am I actually here? Because it's not for my performance, because you can't actually tell me what part of my performance is the problem. You're just kind of throwing stuff at the wall. Whether that's actually true or not is beside the point at that. That's what I'm feeling, because you can't give me these concrete examples.
Oh yeah.
So,
well, the thing about, so the trust piece is huge when you're having a tough conversation. And going back to something Sarah shared earlier in the conversation around checking in on goals, right? Because if I say, Jeremy, what's the most important thing to you around, fill in the blank, right? And you say blah, blah, blah. And I go, oh, Jeremy, I have some feedback related to what you just said. And so again, instead of it being about me, it's now about something that's important to you and me, right? So it's mutual, right? So that's helped to build trust. And then the other piece, step 6, when I said I've got to own my own stuff, meaning like I got to look at, well, what are my own insecurities around this? What's my own baggage? What are my own assumptions? And I state them as assumptions versus the truth. Like Jeremy, I'm assuming that this was going on for you. And I check in with you. Tell me, can you validate that? If I say, Jeremy, here's an inference I had about when we worked together. And, you tell me what your inferences were, right? Or if I say, Jeremy, well, again, this is self-work. I have to say, well, is this a limiting belief that I have about Jeremy? Like, because something happened in the past, I now say it's always going to happen with him. So I have to do my own work around that. And so those goals, and then me doing my own work and looking in the mirror, that helps to build trust, because it helps me to remove the game face. And now I'm being real and open and authentic with you. And that gives you an opportunity to reciprocate with your degree of authenticity first. And I'll do it first. I'll lead with it in hopes that you'll do it. You don't have to, but I'm letting you know how I'm going to show up, right? Which builds trust.
Yeah, that's awesome. Like, I've got a billion questions going through my mind now. This is that's how you know it's a good conversation, right? So, and you mentioned a couple of other things, but I want to start talking about kind of the timing of all of this, because you did mention kind of taking a minute and kind of letting the dust settle a little bit before you have these conversations. But I think in my experience, sometimes what I've seen is some managers are kind of let it go a little bit too long before they have these conversations, like almost to the point where when you're finally brought in to have these conversations, it's almost like, what are you talking about? When was this? Like months ago? What? So I don't know if there's any science to this? Like if there's a number you can put on, like how long to wait to have this conversation, or if it's more of kind of like a gut feeling. I kind of wanted to ask, you know, I know they try to avoid these conversations until they have no choice but to address them. Does that hurt the conversation even more? Does it, like, what's the kind of theory around when to have these conversations?
Well, there's three things that I would say you need to keep in mind regarding the timing. The first one is recency. You want to have it as close to the actual event as possible so that you can specifically recall the facts and the receipts and all of that, right? And you want to avoid allowing it to fester and continue to damage the relationship between us. And let's say if Sarah and I are leaders, and now the organization is noticing, employees are noticing this funky energy between us, which doesn't work well, and it doesn't do good things for the culture. So as soon as possible, from a recency standpoint, for all the reasons I just mentioned, and it could be the same day, or it could be the next day, or it could be a week later. I wouldn't recommend going more than 2 weeks though, because then you lose out on a lot of the things I just talked about, and a lot of the damage can kind of take place. So that's the first thing, recency. The second point from a timing standpoint is, the notion of emotions, right? If we're too emotionally raw at the moment, or tempers are still flared, or what have you, or there's some other issues that are urgent that we need to deal with, we need to kind of allow that to happen, right? Primarily, we need to allow our emotions to calm down so that we can be clear, we can be objective, and that sort of thing, right? So that's the second thing. And so it sort of reminds me of, our three children are adults and moved on now, but sometimes when I used to try to work out things with my kids, it would always be, I got to go deal with this now. And my wife gave me some feedback. She said, you may want to allow the dust to settle or your emotions to simmer before you try to address some of these things. And when I took her advice, I did notice a difference.
100%.
It would work out a lot better when emotions are calm for me and the other person, right? So that's the second thing. And the last one is just, which is connected to the second one, we need to be more objective. And so I think if we can be recent, because we got the facts and they're clear, we can have our emotions, not the thing that's driving it, right? But what are the goals and those kinds of things. And then that all allows us to be more objective. If you take those three principles in mind, the recency, managing your emotions, having that emotional intelligence, and then being objective, you can pretty much work out the timing in most cases. So yeah.
I agree, though. I think there is like a sweet spot there. I know I've waited too long to give feedback before. And then also given it too quickly, and it was fueled by emotion, and that just gets nowhere. So
I agree with you on that one, Sarah. I would honestly, if I had to pick one range of time for feedback, I'd say no later than a week.
yeah, I think it's probably a good rule of thumb.
Sometimes a day is too quick. Sometimes 2 weeks or 30 days is too long.
Yeah.
1 week, I think you can work through most of the three principles I just talked about.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Something that we need to also, I think a good follow-up conversation is not just how to give difficult feedback, but how to receive it too. Like everything that we're talking about also, makes me emotional intelligence, these things. Like it's just as important to be able to receive the feedback and same rules, right? Not letting emotion overwhelm you and
Yeah.
A whole other
Well,
episode, I feel like.
yeah.
well, it is, but I have a quick answer to that.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So, because if you were to frame that into the question that I get often, Sarah, and it is simply framed like this in workshops and seminars and coaching, people will say, well, wait a minute, Al, this all sounds great, but don't both parties need to understand these principles and this model? What do you think the answer is to that? Yes or no? How would you answer that?
I think it'll be more effective if both parties understand those.
Well, so yes, but here's the answer to that. I mean, I agree with you. we can make sure that they understand it. Well, how do you do that, Al? Well, you're teaching it to them by giving them the opportunity to do and express everything that you're doing and expressing. You can check in with them on their goals. You can check in with them on the receipts, so to speak. You can check in on with them in terms of, is there something that didn't work in terms of negative feedback? You can check on with them on, okay, so what are some of the things they need to look at themselves about? And then you can also check with them on the timing, right? And when we get to the 4-step model, everything that you're sharing and articulating with using that 4-step model, you can also give them the opportunity to do the same thing. So you're literally teaching them the model without expressly teaching them the model. Because I'll be honest with you, it probably wouldn't work. I go, Jeremy, come over here. Let me teach you the feedback model as I'm giving you some feedback.
Yeah, that'd be received very well.
Don't try that at home, right? But you can teach the person the model by giving them everything that you need in this model. So
That's a good point.
Yeah, you teach by doing. They don't learn to do, right?
Right.
That's exactly right. All right, so I'm gonna ask kind of the loaded question that we kind of get in the training world whenever this comes up, right? It's always kind of what people think of when they think of these tough conversations, which is there's always kind of the fear that these conversations degrade into some kind of confrontation, right? So, what is the best way to, one, identify that that's kind of the way this conversation is going, and two, to once you get to that point where you're already, I don't know if it's like a shouting match or coming to that point, like how do you identify that that's where you're going, and how do you diffuse the conversation either once you've identified that, or if you haven't identified it, once you're already there, how do you kind of bring it back, or can you bring it back from that point?
Oh yeah, you can definitely bring it back. And there is something that I work with a lot of our coaching clients on that I'll share with you guys regarding how do you kind of get aware in the moment and sort of do some work with yourself instantly to kind of, dissipate some of that energy. But the way that you tell that is probably getting derailed is really, some from an emotional intelligence standpoint, is really paying attention to what's going on inside of you, and you're paying attention to what's happening with the other person. And with yourself, it is, um, and it really comes from some pre-work you can do with yourself on an emotional intelligence standpoint. For example, I know that when my buttons get pushed in a conversation or a situation, a couple of things starts to happen physiologically. Number one, I start to talk a little faster. Number two, I'm usually breathing in my chest. Number three, I may even lean in, towards the person, almost like I'm about to pounce. And I'm told that my eyes even stretch a little bit. So when I notice that these things are happening to me physiologically, I know that in that moment of choice, I need to breathe more. I need to not talk as much. I need to say, you know what, Jeremy, can you say more about what you just said so I can listen, right? I might even pause and say, let me think about that for a moment, right? And I've even called some time out to say, you know what, I don't think that I'm or we're having the conversation in the way that we should, because I feel like we're shouting. I think that every time I try to answer a question, before I answer the question, you're asking me another question. So I don't know if I'm really being listened to right now. So when I notice those things in the other person or myself, we either pause and stop and maybe go gather ourselves and reconnect, or reschedule to have the conversation at a later date, which goes back to timing, right? So from an emotional intelligence standpoint, we've got to pay attention to ourselves and see what's happening inside of ourselves. And we've got to be aware of and pay attention to the energy that's coming from the other person, and be curious and interested in that enough to where we can raise it in an objective way with curiosity and interest, but not in an accusatory way, right? It's like, hey, I'm noticing, what is it that I'm noticing, right? About myself or you. And what's coming up for you around that? And what would you like to do right now, right? Might it make sense for us to reschedule this conversation? Now, I will say this. In that moment, let's say that Jeremy and I are in this tough conversation and we're feeling this energy bubbling up. Our buttons are getting pushed, right? But we want to continue the conversation. In that moment, there's a couple of things that I'd recommend, right? Number one, I'd breathe. I'd take some long, slow, deep breaths. Internally, I would ask myself, why am I getting so emotional right now? Right? I would just stop. Right? Then I would ask myself, which of my buttons just got pushed? Is it that I'm feeling disrespected, which is a highly held value? Is it that I'm not being heard or listened to, which is a highly held value? Is it fill in the blank with your highest held values? Because here's the thing. When your buttons get pushed, guess who is really the catalyst of your buttons? You are the person in the mirror. Why? Because your buttons, your emotions are attached to your highest held values. And when I assume or infer that you're stamping or trampling on my values, then I'm causing some of that. Right now, it could be you and it could be your intentions, but it has to really go back to, wow, is Jeremy really disrespecting me? Or is he trying to get his point across? And my assumption is this is about respect, which now my buttons are getting pushed. And the last thing I have to ask myself when, I'm breathing, I'm stopping, I'm asking why I'm getting so upset. I'm asking about which of my values buttons just got pushed. That's connecting with my values. The last thing I would ask myself in that moment of choice is, what is most important right now? How can we get back to what I call the highest level of system, the thing that is most important that we need to be focused on right now, right? So again, it's emotional intelligence. What's going on inside of me? What's going on with the other person? Am I curious and aware and interested in that? And then how do I stop, breathe, ask, check out the button, and get back to what's important? That's how you kind of dissipate that energy, at least for yourself and potentially for the other person, because in the long run, energy attracts like energy. So you can bring the energy up or down based on how you decide to show up in the moment of choice.
That's interesting. That's a lot of like self-awareness.
Uh-huh.
Like, and I like that. And it takes a lot of like self-awareness steps that I don't think, and maybe this is just me speaking out of turn, but I don't think a ton of people have that level of self-awareness that you would need to do that. But that's great. Like, I would not have thought there would have been a way to kind of pull back on that. But even if, like, thinking of myself, if I'm on the other end of that conversation, like if I were to see you taking those steps to write this conversation, then I would probably be doing the same thing. Right. Like, because, and I think that would be any rational person's response. Like, if you see the other person taking those steps to try to bring the conversation back, I think most people would probably do the same thing and try to at least meet you halfway, or at least I guess I should say I hope they would.
They would. I'll give you a quick testimonial. The first time I get really aware of energy, because in my coach certification training, is based on the premise of energy leadership, right? And that goes back to, energy attracts like energy. And so I was once at the kitchen table typing away on my laptop, and my wife was in the kitchen and she was doing something else in the kitchen near the stove and the sink. And and we weren't necessarily paying attention to each other. We were doing our own thing, but the two of us was in the kitchen alone. And so she started this conversation. And honestly, I can't even remember the topic, but I know it was related to the kids, finances, or chores. I can't remember which, but it was one of those three. and
All
I
fantastic topics for marriage, right? Like, what are the three things marriage people argue about?
Triggering.
Kids,
right? So I felt
money,
energy.
chores.
I felt energy increase in myself, right? And I can also feel it from her, right? But I stopped, right? So I stopped typing. I looked at her, and I called her name, and I said, oh, and I had a smile on my face. And I said, "Are we about to argue right now?" And then she stopped doing what she was doing and she smiled. And we sat down and we had a conversation instead of an argument. So going back to your point, Jeremy, energy attracts like energy. You can bring the energy up or down based on how you intentionally show up in the moment of choice. And so, and it all starts with, what am I even thinking right now? Because that will impact how I'm feeling right now, which will impact how I'm behaving right now. The thinking, emotion, and behavior, they're all connected, right? So that goes back to the energy leadership principle that energy attracts like energy. So but having that emotional awareness, and growing that emotional awareness like a muscle, right? There's things that we can do to grow it, which is a whole nother conversation, but it's doable. And a lot of our coaching clients, we do that work with them so that they can show up as a leader to be their highest and best all the time. So yeah.
It's funny because I feel like a lot of our conversations always circle back to self-awareness. It's so important.
It is
But-
hugely important. Hugely important.
Yeah,
it's
I think
tough.
a lot of these leadership like tips are very high on self-awareness. And I think that may end up being like a key theme running through this entire season is like great leaders first and foremost are more aware of themselves than they are anything else. Like I feel like that's got to be like the number one skill of really good leaders is just having a high amount of self-awareness.
Well,
So,
it is. It is. There's even some data behind it. I read the July and August 2022 edition of Harvard Business Review. And I was on a business trip, and I had some time to kill on the plane. So I picked up a copy at the bookstore, at the airport bookstore. Anyway, what they said was, hey, in this modern era, in order to be effective at the C-suite level, here are the things that you need: emotional intelligence, how to manage conflict, being inclusive, leading change, those kinds of things. Now, it also said, well, the traditional pedigree is also still needed: finance, administration, operations, technology. That hadn't gone anywhere. But what they showed with their data, they did a 20-year study, and they showed with the data that the traditional pedigree was pretty flat, right? Oh, we still need administration, technology, operations, and finance. Boom, over 20 years, hadn't changed. But the social emotional stuff was doing this. And the data that they used, the data set that they used was C-suite level search firm job descriptions. Like not Al's data, not Jeremy's data, not Sarah's data, but let's go to people who hire C-suite level talent all over the world, and let's get all of their job descriptions, and let's put it in this, I don't know, in vivo software, sentiment analysis. And they've determined that, wow, the social emotional skills has skyrocketed, hockey stick, right? But the traditional pedigree was pretty flat. And it said, if you expect to be an effective leader in this era without these things, forget it. Forget it. Society has changed. Employee expectations have changed. Investors' expectations have changed. Everything has changed, and it's not going back in the genie. So to your point, the social emotional piece and inclusion piece and conflict and change piece is required. It's not a nice to have. It used to be called, oh, that's the mushy soft skill stuff. The mushy soft skill stuff is required now.
It's funny you say that because in the training world of L&D, right? I can't tell you how many times curriculum has to be cut to save time. And for so many years, it was traditionally we're cutting the soft skills pieces. And then it's like in the last, I would say 6 or 7 years, there's been this epiphany of like, wait a minute, that's really important. And some of those things are teachable. A lot of them are, I think, behaviors that people have naturally. And when it comes to training, you can help people access those things or, how to use those tools. But it really does for me, I can't tell you how many times I've fought for that to keep the soft skills and lost that battle years ago.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's definitely something that I think more and more people are recognizing and realizing. And but one thing I will say, the fastest growing segment of the workforce, the millennials, I think they get it and they're
Yeah.
actually asking for it and they expect it, right?
Yes.
So they're shifting things as well. So yeah, supply and
Yep.
demand.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Sarah and I are both, she hates this term, so I'm going to use it as much as I can. We are what they call geriatric millennials.
Eh.
We're like that first and second year millennials, right?
That's the first time. That's the
I
first.
would
I've never
rather
heard that.
say elder
It was like,
millennium.
there was one
That's
study
bad.
that I read from the Times, and it was probably like 3 or 4 years ago now that used that term, geriatric millennial. And I shared it with my wife, and she said, I love this study that you sent me, but don't you ever call us geriatric millennials.
Thank you. I agree.
Ever since then, I'm like, that's just the term that I'm going to use from now on.
Well, and there's a lot of people out. I mean, look at the current presidential race, right? And the the senior status of the two folks who are now the presumptive nominees, right? And it's bringing this whole notion of ageism to the front, front and center. That wow, do we just toss people away when they hit a certain age, or do they? And if they still have something of value that they want to contribute and things that we can learn from them, what's the best way to do that, right? So I think even that, right, which, that might speak to your wife and Sarah's reaction to the term, it is really front and center and it's at the top of a lot of people's mind and it's a bit paradoxical. Like we want to be respectful and we want to leverage the wisdom, but at the same time, are there some things happening inside of us that see them as, oh, are they useful? Are they sharp? Can they still do things, right? It's like it's a bit of a paradox.
Yeah, and I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole because I feel like that's a whole other episode.
That just opened up a whole part of my brain that has me thinking about a lot of things.
Yeah,
we're gonna get back, right?
Yeah, we're gonna put that on the list of future topics. But so to get us back on topic. So I did have one other question that I wanted to get to because we're running a bit long. But so I have a bit of a kind of a scenario for you. So let's say that some kind of incident has happened, right? So I'll use myself as an example. So I'm leading a team, and this scenario has happened, and I need to have a tough conversation with somebody that is on my team. However, this type of conversation, for some reason or another, has some type of personal meaning for me. So it's either it's triggering for me, maybe it, makes me remember something that has happened to me personally, not necessarily with this person, but just something in my past. Maybe it's really too close to something that has happened to my family or to somebody that is personal to me, or something that I don't know that I can separate my bias to be able to have this conversation. Is it still a point where I should have this conversation? Or is it a point where maybe I should hand this conversation off to another person on my membership team to have that conversation? Even though this person is on my team, like this is my responsibility as the leader of this team to have this conversation.
Yeah. So I love that. And so let's actually use the 4-step model to answer your question. So I'll give you the 4-step model first, and then we'll use this scenario you just brought up, Jeremy, to have the conversation. So the 4-step model is this. I actually call it the 4F feedback model, right? And the first F is the facts. What are the facts? Like this is, well, what do I actually do when I'm in the conversation? Well, these 4 steps. Number 1, what are the facts, right? Yesterday during the meeting at 3 o'clock when you said blah, 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 right? Mm-hmm. Stating the facts, replaying the video. The second step is, well, the formulations, right? Well, what are the things that's going on in my head, right? What is my doubt? What is my baggage? What are my assumptions? What are my inferences, right? Those kinds of things. So the formulations. The third F are the feelings, right? This is where I take off the game face. This is how this made me feel. Let me understand, how did it make you feel? Like I said, everything that you're asking for, you give them that same opportunity to share, right? And the fourth and final F is future, right? So what do we need going forward the next time this happened? And are you willing to give that to me? And am I willing to give you what you need? So those are the four F's, right? What are the facts? What are the formulations, the story I'm making up in my head that I need to check out with you, not necessarily saying it's valid? Then what are my feelings, right? Because now we're getting real. We're taking the game face off. And then lastly, what's the future? How do we deal with this going forward? So now, with that four-step model, the facts, the formulations, the feelings, and the future, let's take your scenario and run them through this model to test it out, right? And so if I understand you correctly, you said, hey, there's something I want to talk to you about, project, team, deadlines, whatever, but I've got some personal skin in the game and some personal issues, and I don't know if I should even have this conversation, right? That's what I'm understanding you say, correct?
That's exactly right. Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. So you be you, and I will at least, hypothetically act like I know about this situation. So you got to give me a little bit of grace, right? And just go.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So, no, I'll be you because I'm the one who want to give the feedback, and then you can be Al, I guess. Right. So I'm the one with the issues, and I'm the one who want to give you feedback. All right. So, Al, is it okay that we have a quick conversation? I want to check in with you about something.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So now's a good time for you?
Sure.
So the first thing I want to do, Al, is check in with you on what's important to you about doing podcast meetings. What's the most important thing to you about doing podcasts?
Really, it's just trying to make sure that for any topic that we bring up, it's making sure that we provide accurate information and get that information off in a way that is educational as well as entertaining.
Okay, good. Well, so I'm understanding you want it to be accurate, you want to be entertaining, and you want to kind of get it out there to as many people as you can, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yes, sir.
Well, so there's some feedback I have for you about doing the podcast that we just did. Is that okay? Can I share some of the feedback with you?
Absolutely.
Well, so the thing that I want to share is, the fact that we scheduled the podcast and you had to change it a few times. And one of those times it was kind of late notice. I, that was really causing some problems for us. And I got to be honest with you. My assumption was, I don't know if this guy really wants to do the podcast. I'm not so sure he's into this thing, right? And I got to be honest. I was thinking that, wow, is it me or is it him? Right? Self-doubt was coming up for me, right? And the way that made me feel was, I'm like, I don't know if Al values our time, right? And so I kind of want to just check in with him. And so the last thing I'll say to close this is, when we do future podcasts together, especially if we get an opportunity to do something together, let's just make sure that if there's going to be a change, we can give each other enough advance notice, right, for rescheduling, and that also that we give each other an opportunity to maybe brainstorm a little bit about the podcast before we do it. How's that sound to you, Al?
Yeah, it sounds great to me. I mean, that sounds good.
Got it. So let's stop, right? So what did you guys hear about the facts? What facts did I share?
So it was that you had heard that there was some scheduling issues, right?
Or there
And
was
that-
scheduling issues.
Yeah,
There were scheduling issues.
that there
Yeah.
were scheduling issues. Yeah.
Right. And then what were the assumptions and the self-doubt going on inside of my own head that I shared, that I pointed at myself, and I didn't make it your
My
issue.
behavior or
Right.
something I've done or
Right.
you.
So to Jeremy's point, I'm like, I got some self-doubt myself here. So I'm pointing at myself, not the other person.
Yeah.
And I got some assumptions, inferences, limiting beliefs, or whatever, right? But I pointed, and that's the crux of your question, Jeremy. If I got challenges going on inside of me internally, I just state them, but I own them. I don't
Right.
put them on you. I've got to own them, right? All of my assumptions and such. And then I shared how I felt, right? Don't know if my time is being valued. And then I close with, going forward, when we do future podcasts, let's at least give each other this. And then you can kind of go through the 4 F's yourself and tell me how you saw it, what your feelings were, and what you need. And then that way we can kind of have that exchange. So there you go.
Awesome.
Very smooth delivery of
That's
feedback.
right.
Really, it's very insightful. And what I like is the accountability piece is like, admitting, like, is it me? Is there, or being open to the fact that Jeremy could have feedback for me as well. Maybe there was a reason why he kept rescheduling, and it is me. Or you know what I mean? And so it's a really good way to have that dialogue and not come across as accusatory. Leveling the playing field.
Yeah.
Well, I
And
like
so,
it.
so what I love about what you just said, Sarah, is this, and this is what makes feedback work. So number one, this is about understanding and reconciliation. So keeping that paradigm in mind. And then it's also about, if I have an assumption, I have to own it and point at myself.
Mm-hmm.
Like, Jeremy, I'm not so sure you're into this. So that's an assumption I had. Can you let me know how you feel about working with me on this podcast, right? So instead of saying, Jeremy, you're disrespecting my time, you're doing this, you're doing that, I'm going, no, Jeremy, here's what I'm thinking. Can you validate this for me? So that's the key, is like, I can have an assumption. People, oh, don't make assumptions about me. You can have assumptions. If I can assume, is it safe for me to walk down a dark alley at 3 a.m.? Or is it better for me to walk down a well-lit path to get to my car? We make assumptions all the time. The thing with feedback, we have to own our assumptions instead of projecting them or transferring them on the other person. That's the thing that people get twisted a bit. Stop making assumptions. No, we got a brain. You need to think about things, right? Consciously. So make an assumption, but own your own assumptions. Don't put them on other people.
That's fantastic. And
Yeah.
yeah, we could just keep talking about this, but like I said, we're gonna I want to make sure you have some time here at the end of the episode. So we're gonna cut it there. Al, I'm gonna give you, the last 6 minutes here. They're yours. Plug what you want, say however you want to kind of end the episode here. Floor is yours.
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to say thank you both to you, Sarah, and you, Jeremy, for allowing me to come into the Lumious world and talk about stuff that I love talking about and the work that I love doing. Like I said, I have to oftentimes pinch myself. Wow, I get paid for this? This is actual work. So I really do enjoy the work that we get to do. Again, for those of you who hopefully found value in in the conversation that we had here today, feel free to reach out, connect with us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, those kinds of places, and check out more of our content, definitely here at Lumious and also at Inspirus Consulting. At Inspirus Consulting, like I said, we're an organizational development firm focused in the applied behavioral sciences. We do things like organizational assessments, leadership coaching, team development, custom training, keynotes, and C-suite level inclusive recruiting. And so we'd love to, and I would even add process improvement. As you would think about the people-related process improvement, we have a Six Sigma Master Black Belt person who can help you to understand, dissect, re-engineer, or create any process, whether that's recruiting, talent, you name it, right? So that's what we do. That's how we do it. Check us out at inspirusconsulting.com. And hopefully you found it valuable today to learn about feedback, which is the 2 key insights. It's about understanding and reconciliation. So I'll stop there.
Awesome. I want to thank everybody for listening, and we'll catch you next time. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Al. Thanks, everybody.